The ark rested upon the heights of Ararat like a silent monument, its timbers still damp with the breath of the storm. The air was heavy with the scent of earth newly uncovered, a mingling of freshness and something ancient that had lain buried beneath the flood. Noah stepped out first, his feet pressing into soil that had not felt the weight of man for months. Around him, the mountains wore crowns of mist, and streams carved new paths through the valleys below. It was a world reborn, stripped bare, awaiting the hands that would shape it again. But beneath the stillness was an unease no one could name. The rain had ceased. The fountains of the deep were shut, and the bow in the clouds marked a covenant of peace. Yet peace is not always the absence of war. It is sometimes only the pause before it begins anew. In the silence after judgment, something unseen lingered. Watching, the surface was cleansed, yes, but the question rose like the morning fog: had the darkness truly been drowned, or had it found a way to survive the waters? The scriptures tell us that everything with the breath of life, save those within the ark, perished. And yet the patterns of corruption that had brought the world to ruin would reappear with startling speed. This was not merely the inevitability of human weakness, it hinted at a deeper continuity, an unseen thread stretching from the age before the flood into the age after. The Book of Jubilees dares to suggest that the enemy's seed was not entirely erased, that forces ancient and defiant still moved beneath the fragile crust of this new world. Imagine standing there with Noah and his sons, staring at the unmarked horizon. There is no city, no tower, no noise of markets or soldiers, only the wind and the cry of distant birds. You believe you are alone on the earth, but the stillness can be deceptive. The flood may have scoured the soil, but can water reach the hidden caverns where spirits dwell? Can it erase memory from the minds of those who remember the forbidden arts? What if some legacies are not of flesh and blood, but of words, oaths, and invisible chains that no deluge can break in that fragile dawn of the post-flood world? The ground was firm underfoot, yet the foundations of history were already trembling. What had been judged still breathed somewhere. What had been exiled still sought a way back. And as the survivors set their eyes to the work of beginning again, the story they thought was finished had already begun to write its next chapter. The story of the post-flood world in most Bibles is brief scattered verses, passing references, a few genealogies, and then the narrative moves on. It gives the impression that after the ark landed and the rainbow appeared, the rest was merely the slow rebuilding of life, a return to order. But the Book of Jubilees refuses to let this moment be reduced to a footnote. It lingers here, unfolding a chapter most have never heard, as though it knows that the seed of all that will come afterward lies in this fragile dawn. In Genesis, Noah plants a vineyard, his sons disperse, and nations slowly form. In Jubilees, the moment is far more deliberate, almost ceremonial. The land is not simply inhabited, it is divided with precision. Borders are drawn, territories assigned, covenants sworn. It is as if God himself is re-establishing Eden's boundaries on a grand scale, giving each lineage a place in the unfolding design of history. And behind this divine order is an urgent purpose to ensure that the chaos which drowned the old world does not bleed into the new. But even in this careful ordering, there is a tension you can feel beneath the words. Jubilees names the sons and the grandsons, mapping their inheritances across the earth. But in doing so, it also sows the first hints of dispute. Boundaries can preserve peace, but they can also tempt ambition. The ink on this new map was barely dry before it began to smudge. The same soil that had swallowed the bodies of the antediluvian world would soon drink in the first drops of post-flood conflict. Consider how this scene would have looked the Ark resting far above. The slopes of Ararat descending into valleys still scarred by floodwaters, and the patriarch's family gathered in solemn assembly. The air is clear, the light sharp, and the memory of judgment still burns in every heart. There is reverence as Noah pronounces the divisions, speaking with the weight of one who has seen the end of the world and lived. Yet somewhere in those listening hearts, perhaps in a glance, perhaps in an unspoken thought, the first seeds of discontent are already germinating. The Book of Jubilees makes no attempt to hide the seriousness of this division of land. It records the boundaries in almost tedious detail, naming rivers, mountains, and coastlines as if to bind future generations to this arrangement beyond dispute. Why such care? Because this was not simply about geography, it was about destiny. Each portion of land was tied to a divine allotment, a spiritual inheritance. To trespass was not just to claim another's field, it was to rebel against the order of heaven. And yet, even as the ink was drying, history was preparing to test those boundaries. What had been set apart for peace would become the very ground upon which the next battles of the human story would be fought. The rainbow still arched in the sky, but shadows were already lengthening across the new earth. The flood was meant to be the great erasure, the clean slate on which humanity's story could be rewritten without the stains of the past. Every living creature outside the ark had perished. Every stronghold of corruption was swept away. Yet the Book of Jubilees dares to whisper what most would never imagine: not all of the old world had truly vanished. In the quiet years after the flood, when the soil was still tender underfoot and the smell of rain still clung to the air, strange echoes began to surface. They were not the cries of the drowned, nor the remnants of a drowned civilization rising from the mud. These were living shadows, descendants whose presence defied the simplicity of the official story. Genesis moves quickly from the flood to the genealogy of Noah's sons, as though their lines were pure and untainted. Jubilees, however, opens the curtain a little wider. It hints at something troubling: that vestiges of the pre-flood rebellion had somehow found their way onto the ark, not in the form of forbidden spirits storming the gangplank, but in the quiet persistence of bloodlines, memories, and secret allegiances. Some of the old world's knowledge, learned from the watchers before the deluge, would re-emerge in whispers, carried by those who had heard it before the judgment came. Consider Ham, whose line would bear both blessing and curse. In Jubilees, the implication is not that he was an open conspirator with the forces of the old world, but that in him, and perhaps in his descendants, there lingered a readiness to bend toward those forbidden paths once more. This was not an accident of character. It was the slow pulse of an inheritance older than the flood itself. The giants, the Nephilim, had been cut down, yet their legacy proved more durable than flesh. The seed in biblical terms is not only the genetic, it is the spiritual imprint, the pattern of defiance against the Most High. In the ancient mind, the blood could carry memory, and memory, if nourished, could bring back what was thought extinct. The post-flood world looked safe, but in the shadows of tents and in the quiet exchange of stories, the pre-flood world was being remembered, piece by piece. Skills forbidden by heaven, tales of the Watcher's teachings, the intoxicating vision of power unbounded by divine command, all of it smoldered beneath the surface like embers in dry grass. It would take only the right wind to set it ablaze again. The Book of Jubilees does not tell this part to frighten, but to warn. The enemy had not drowned. He had adapted. His servants no longer walked as towering giants that could be spotted from a mile away. They wore the faces of men, spoke the tongues of brothers, and built their houses on inherited ground. What had been before would come again, not as a roaring tide, but as a creeping, deliberate advance. And so the stage was set. The earth was new, the covenant fresh, but the bloodline that should have ended in the waters still pulsed quietly beneath the skin of the human story. In the aftermath of the flood, when the earth still glistened with the waters of judgment, God spoke again, not with the thunder of destruction, but with the measured voice of a lawgiver. This was not the same world that had existed before, and so the rules could not remain the same. The flood had been a reckoning. Now came the charter for survival. The Book of Jubilees paints this moment with striking detail. God's words to Noah were not mere suggestions. They were the foundational pillars of the post-flood order. At their center stood a command that echoed like a drumbeat through the generations. The blood is sacred. You shall not eat the blood of any flesh. The command declared, for the life of all flesh is in the blood. This was more than a dietary restriction. It was a boundary line between the holy and the profane. In the ancient worldview, blood was not just fluid, it was the vessel of the soul, the breath of God woven into living creatures. To consume it was to take into oneself the life that belonged to the Creator alone. Before the flood, the corruption of mankind had known no restraint. Violence had filled the earth, and the shedding of blood had become as common as the tilling of soil. In the new world, that could not be allowed to happen again. The covenant of blood was both a protection and a reminder. Life does not belong to man to take at will. Each animal slain for food, each drop spilled upon the ground, was to be treated with reverence. Jubilees emphasizes that this law was not a temporary measure, but a perpetual commandment for all generations forever. It was a sacred hedge, meant to guard against the same reckless violence that had triggered the flood. But the law was more than preventative, it was prophetic. To respect the blood was to recognize that one day, a greater blood would be offered, a life poured out for the redemption of many. This covenant was sealed alongside other commands to avoid idolatry, to honor justice, to walk in the fear of God. Together, they formed the moral architecture of the new humanity. In Jubilees, these were not vague ideals, they were recorded as eternal decrees, written on the heavenly tablets, as if engraved in the archives of eternity itself. Imagine Noah standing before his sons, repeating these words. The mountain wind carries his voice across the valleys, and every ear is attentive. Behind him, The Ark looms as a monument to both judgment and mercy. Before him, the unmarked expanse of the world awaits their stewardship. He is not merely instructing them on how to survive, he is handing them the keys to remaining in covenant with the God who spared them. Yet, as sacred as these commands were, the pages of history would reveal how fragile human obedience can be. The covenant of blood was intended to protect the earth from the violence of the past, but soon, the very boundaries God had set would be tested. The flood had not only washed away the cities of men, it had wiped clean the rhythm of the earth. The sun still rose and set, the moon still waxed and waned. But the sacred order of days, the divine heartbeat that governed the appointed times, had been lost in the chaos. In the Book of Jubilees, the restoration of this rhythm is more than a practical act. It is a re-establishment of heaven's own clock. In those first years after the waters receded, God revealed to Noah the structure of time as it was meant to be kept, a year of 364 days, perfectly ordered into weeks, months, and seasons. This was not the fluctuating lunar cycle of later calendars, but a system that reflected a cosmic design, an eternal symmetry that mirrored the heavenly realm. To step into this calendar was to walk in harmony with the Creator's design, to let the flow of days carry you in the same current that moves the stars. Jubilees describes this as the calendar of the covenant, the same pattern that had governed Eden before sin disrupted creation's order. Every feast, every Sabbath, every appointed time was anchored in this structure. Lose it, and the appointed times would drift into confusion. Hold to it, and the people would remain aligned with God's will. Noah received this revelation not as an abstract teaching, but as an urgent safeguard. God warned that in future generations, men would alter the reckoning of time, moving the appointed feasts away from their seasons. The result would be a slow erosion of covenant faithfulness, not through open rebellion, but through the subtle shifting of days until the holy was indistinguishable from the common. Time itself could become a weapon in the hands of the adversary. Imagine Noah marking out the first year on fresh parchment or stone, carving the sequence of days and weeks, watching as each Sabbath returned like the steady tolling of a bell. For him, every turn of the calendar was a reminder the same God who commands the sea also commands the seasons. The same voice that set the boundaries of the waters now set the boundaries of time. In this post-flood world, the restoration of the calendar was not merely a tool for agriculture or governance. It was a sacred trust, a tether to the divine order that held the universe together. Each sunrise was not just the start of another day, it was a step along the great circle of appointed times, moving toward purposes older than the world itself. But as we will see, the keeping of this sacred rhythm would not last unchallenged. The seeds of distortion were already lying dormant, waiting for a generation bold or foolish enough to rewrite the heavens' clock. The sacred calendar was more than numbers and days, it was the backbone of covenant life. To live by it was to live in step with the rhythm of heaven itself. But the Book of Jubilees warns that a day would come when men would tamper with this divine framework. And when that day came, it would not look like open rebellion, it would look like progress, practicality, or even harmless adjustment. The danger was subtle: alter the measure of time, and you alter the measure of worship. Change the calendar, and you quietly change the feasts. the Sabbaths, the moments when heaven and earth are meant to meet. What had been appointed by God would slowly slide out of its season, until the connection between the Creator's command and man's obedience was severed. Jubilees records that this twisting of time was not accidental. It was part of a spiritual strategy, a way for the adversary to erode the covenant without ever demanding that it be broken outright. People would still think themselves faithful, they would still gather, still celebrate, but not on the days written on the heavenly tablets. They would keep the motions of religion, while missing the appointed encounters with the living God. Imagine a watchtower in the distance, meant to sound the alarm at the precise moment of danger. Now imagine that someone quietly moves the clock forward by an hour. The watchman still sounds the horn, but by then, the enemy has already crossed the walls. That is what the distortion of time would mean for God's people: an unguarded gate, left open because the clock no longer told the truth. In the early post-flood years, Noah and his sons guarded the calendar faithfully, counting the weeks with care. Each Sabbath returned exactly on its mark. Each feast landed in its ordained season. But as the generations multiplied, so did the temptations to bend time to human convenience. Farmers might want to shift the feasts to match harvest cycles. Rulers might adjust the weeks to suit military campaigns. Priests might compromise the count to align with foreign systems. Every small change would seem reasonable until, over time, the sacred pattern was lost entirely. God's warning to Noah was clear: if you lose the calendar, you lose the covenant. And yet, in the centuries that followed, this very warning would be fulfilled. The sacred days would drift, the feasts would be displaced, and the link between heaven's clock and man's worship would grow faint. It was not merely a mistake in scheduling, it was the quiet theft of the appointed times, the slow untethering of earth from the rhythm of heaven. The stage was being set for an even deeper fracture, one that would not only twist time but divide the human family itself. And that fracture would come in the form of inheritance, borders, and the destinies written into the very map of the world. In the quiet years after the flood, as the earth began to flourish again, the family of Noah stood at the center of all humanity. Every man, woman, and child alive could trace their lineage to one of his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, or Japheth. But these were not merely bloodlines, they were prophetic lines, each carrying a portion of the earth and a portion of destiny. The Book of Jubilees describes the moment when the land was formally divided among them. This was not a casual arrangement made over a shared meal. It was a sacred act, done under oath, sealed in the presence of God. Each son received his inheritance as both a gift and a charge, with borders that were meant to endure for all generations forever. The text lingers over the boundaries, naming rivers, mountains, and coastlines with painstaking precision, as though to inscribe them into the very memory of heaven. Shem, the eldest, was given the heartland's territory stretching from the middle of the earth outward, encompassing the places that would one day cradle the story of God's covenant people. Ham received the lands to the south and west, rich and fertile, but shadowed by a warning that his descendants must not covet or encroach upon the inheritance of his brothers. Japheth was given the lands to the north and east, wide and expansive, opening toward distant coasts and islands. The division was not only geographic, it was spiritual. In this moment, God was drawing lines not just across the soil, but across the unfolding drama of history. These boundaries were meant to guard peace, preserve order, and prevent the mingling of destinies that could lead to conflict. To cross them was not simply to trespass, it was to rebel against the order of heaven. And yet, even as the agreements were sworn, the seeds of defiance were already in the ground. The human heart does not easily accept limits. The promise of unclaimed territory beyond one's borders can stir ambition, and ambition can awaken envy. One day, those carefully drawn lines would blur. Disputes over land would become wars. Boundaries meant to protect would become boundaries to conquer. Still, for a time, the three branches of Noah's family grew in relative harmony, each settling into their allotted places. Villages sprang up along rivers, fields were tilled, and the earth, newly cleansed, seemed to welcome its caretakers. But beneath the surface of this peace, history's currents were already shifting. The destinies of Shem, Ham, and Japheth would not remain separate for long, and when they collided, the world would feel the tremor. The post-flood order was meant to be unshakable territories fixed, covenants sealed, each family bound by the oath sworn before God. But even in those first years, a moment came that cracked the surface of this fragile peace. It began not with armies or the clash of weapons, but with a single act inside a tent. The story is familiar from Genesis. Noah, after planting a vineyard, became drunk and lay uncovered within his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his brothers. Shem and Japheth, walking backward, covered their father without looking upon him. When Noah awoke, he pronounced a curse not on Ham directly, but on Canaan, Ham's son. The Book of Jubilees does not treat this as a passing domestic incident. It presents it as a turning point, an unveiling of a deeper disposition. Ham's action, whether driven by mockery, dishonor, or a violation more serious than the text explicitly states, revealed a fault line in his heart. This was not just a son dishonoring his father, it was the stirring of a spirit unwilling to submit to the boundaries God had set. The curse upon Canaan was not arbitrary. In the world view of the ancients, the son carried the future of the father's line, and a flaw in the father's conduct could echo through his descendants. Noah's words were prophetic, shaping the destiny of entire nations yet unborn. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Here, the seed of rebellion was sown. Canaan's descendants, rather than living in quiet submission to the order of heaven, would one day become a people known for crossing forbidden lines, occupying lands not allotted to them, reviving practices of the pre-flood world, and setting themselves against the covenant people. The curse was not a sentence without cause. It was the naming of a reality that would unfold in history. Imagine the tension around the family encampment after Noah spoke those words. The air would have been thick with unspoken questions. Shem and Japheth, holding their lands and blessings, must have felt the weight of what had just been declared. Ham's household, shadowed by the curse on Canaan, would have had to reckon with the fact that the division of land and destiny was now marked by a wound that could not be healed by diplomacy. Jubilees treats this episode as more than a family dispute. It is the first clear sign that the post-flood world will not remain pure for long. Within a single generation, dishonor had breached the covenant, and the shadow of rebellion had begun to stretch across the map of the earth. This shadow would grow in the decades to come, not through sudden violence, but through the quiet building of settlements and cities, places where ambition could take root and the memory of the old world could be revived. And it is to the birth of these first strongholds that our story now turns. The flood had wiped the earth clean of its old towers and palaces, leaving no trace of the cities where the Watchers had once walked among men. But human hands are restless. They cannot long endure the open horizon without shaping it, enclosing it, and claiming it. It did not take many generations after the curse of Canaan for the first walls to rise again. The Book of Jubilees hints at the early spread of settlements, villages becoming towns, towns swelling into cities. These were not merely places to dwell, they were declarations. Every city was a stake driven into the earth, saying, "This is ours." The flood had reminded mankind of God's ownership of the world. Cities, in time, would begin to whisper the opposite. The first post-flood city was small by modern standards, little more than a fortified gathering of dwellings, yet it marked a turning point in human history. For within those walls, something more than shelter was being built: a culture, an identity, a memory of the world before judgment. Streets formed where once there were only paths. Marketplaces emerged where people traded not only goods, but stories, some from the time before the waters came, whispered like forbidden treasures. The presence of Canaanite blood in these settlements gave them a distinct character. The curse had not diminished ambition. If anything, it had sharpened it. Those under the shadow of Noah's words seemed determined to carve their own destiny, to defy the prophecy spoken over them. And in their drive to prove themselves, they began to recover practices best left drowned with the old world. Imagine standing on a hill and looking down at this first city. The houses are clustered close, their walls of stone and mud brick rising above the plain. Smoke curls from cooking fires. The voices of traders mingle with the cries of children. At first glance, it is a picture of life and progress, but listen closely, and you might hear the murmurs of elders recalling arts of building, governance, and perhaps even sorcery arts that had once drawn down the wrath of heaven. In Genesis, the growth of cities is told in passing. In Jubilees, the weight is heavier. Each city is more than a collection of homes. It is a node of influence, a center from which culture radiates. And culture can carry light or shadow. The first city after the flood was not yet a Babylon, but the seeds were there. The human heart had not changed, only the stage was new. This stronghold would not be the last. Others would follow, larger, bolder, more ambitious, until the earth once again bore the marks of man's desire to rise and to rule. And in those ambitions, the old alliances between flesh and the fallen would find fertile ground once more. The next chapter in this unfolding story would not be written in stone or clay, but in whispers from beyond the veil, voices that had been silent, yet never truly gone. The flood had cast the Watchers from the stage of human history, or so it seemed. Those towering beings, whose forbidden union with the daughters of men had brought forth the Nephilim, had been bound in chains, their judgment sealed. Yet the Book of Jubilees hints at a chilling truth. Absence is not the same as silence. Though the Watchers no longer walked openly among mankind, their influence did not vanish with the waters. In the years after the first cities rose, whispers began to weave through the settlements. Skills resurfaced, methods of metalworking, arts of enchantment, knowledge of the stars. None of these were inherently evil, but in the wrong hands, they became the same tools that had corrupted the world before the flood. Jubilees suggests that certain spirits, offspring of the giants, disembodied after their death, still roamed the earth. They could not create, but they could corrupt. They could not build, but they could whisper, and whisper they did. These whispers were subtle at first, clothed in the language of progress. A craftsman is taught to temper metal with a technique remembered from before. A chieftain learns a pattern of governance that consolidates power in his hands. A healer experiments with herbs in ways that bend the body towards strange alterations. Each step feels like advancement, yet each step leads further from the purity of the covenant. Imagine walking the narrow streets of one of these new cities. The air is thick with the smell of cooking and the dust of construction. At the city's edge, children play in the shadow of a new wall. But in a dimly lit corner, a man teaches a group of apprentices to mark clay tablets with symbols older than the flood symbols, not of trade or law, but of invocation. To the untrained eye, it is harmless tradition. To those who know, it is the reopening of a door that should have stayed sealed. Jubilees does not romanticize this resurgence, it warns against it. The world after the flood was not a blank canvas. It was a field where seeds from the old age lay buried, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The Watchers may have been chained, but their teachings were like embers scattered in the soil, ready to flare when fanned by human ambition. This return of forbidden knowledge did not erupt all at once. It spread slowly, almost invisibly, through stories, rituals, and the pride of those who wished to be as the mighty men of old. And as it spread, it prepared the way for the next great act of defiance, a project so vast that it would draw the gaze of heaven once more and summon a response that would shape the nations forever. It began, as many great human undertakings do, with an idea so compelling that it seemed beyond question. The people, still united in language and purpose, looked upon the broad plain of Shinar and imagined a monument to their strength. It would be a city, yes, but its crown would be a tower, rising so high that it would pierce the veil between earth and heaven. Genesis tells us this was an act of pride, a bid to make a name for themselves. The Book of Jubilees offers a sharper edge to the story. The tower was not simply a monument to unity, it was a mechanism, an instrument designed to call down the heavenly realm itself. The generations after the flood had inherited just enough of the forbidden knowledge to believe such a thing was possible. They remembered stories of the Watchers descending in the days before the waters came, and they sought to reverse that descent. The work began with brick and bitumen, the same materials that had built the strongholds of the old world. Day after day, the tower climbed higher, its base expanding like the roots of a tree that meant to anchor itself forever. The people labored with zeal, driven not only by the promise of glory, but by a deeper motive, the fear of scattering. In their minds, to remain united under one banner was to be safe from the kind of judgment that had drowned the earth. But in reality, their unity was not in obedience to God, it was in defiance of Him. Imagine standing at the base of that rising tower. The shadow it casts lengthens with every story added. The air is filled with the sound of hammers, the rhythm of countless feet climbing scaffolds. Overseers shout instructions in a single, unbroken language, their words carrying without the confusion of dialect. It feels unstoppable, an entire world working as one. But heaven was not silent. The God who had marked the rainbow as a sign of covenant now looked down upon a people whose ambition was rewriting the boundaries He had set. The tower was more than a building, it was a statement. We will reach you on our terms. The voice of the Lord came, not in a flood this time, but in a decree that would strike at the root of their unity, the scattering of their speech. Jubilees describes the moment with a stark clarity. One instant, the workers called out to each other with perfect understanding. The next, their words became as noise, each man hearing only the babble of foreign tongues. Confusion rippled through the ranks, halting the work. Brick fell from hands. Plans dissolved in frustration. The tower stood unfinished, a monument, not to human greatness, but to the limits of human pride. The scattering of language was not merely a punishment, it was a course correction, forcing the nations to spread into the territories allotted to them. The boundaries established in the days of Noah would now be enforced by the very barriers of speech. But even as the people dispersed, the seeds of division and ambition traveled with them, carried in their stories, their customs, and their longing for what the tower had promised. The world was now fractured in tongue, divided in territory, yet united in one thing, the human capacity to resist the will of heaven. And that resistance would find new shapes in the kingdoms that soon rose from the dust of Babel. The day the tower's work ceased, the plain of Shinar echoed with a strange sound, a chorus of voices speaking, but none understanding. What had been one language now fractured into many. The shift was instant, irreversible, and disorienting. Where there had been perfect communication, now there was only confusion. Men called to their neighbors and received only puzzled stares. Instructions that had once been obeyed with precision were now met with incomprehension. Arguments flared, not out of hostility at first, but out of the frustration of being unheard. And as frustration turned to distrust, bonds began to fray. The Book of Jubilees frames this as more than a linguistic event. It was a dividing of hearts. Shared language had been the thread that bound the people together, a common melody to which they all walked in step. When that melody shattered into countless rhythms, they could no longer march as one. Groups began to form along the lines of mutual understanding, each gathering around those who shared their tongue. And as each group turned inward, they turned away from the others. Imagine the city in those days, builders abandoning their posts, families packing what they could carry, leaders rallying followers to seek new lands. The sound of unity, the hum of voices all speaking the same, was gone, replaced by the dissonance of 100 dialects. Even gestures and symbols failed to bridge the gap for long. It was as if the very air had been rewoven, making former friends into strangers. Jubilees suggests that this was not simply a punishment for pride, but a safeguard. Left united in their defiance, mankind might have pursued ambitions far worse than the tower. By scattering them in speech and in place, God slowed the march toward collective rebellion. Yet the cost of this mercy was steep. The loss of shared language meant the loss of shared memory. Stories once held in common now splintered, evolving differently in each group, until even the truth of what had happened at the tower was told in conflicting ways. As the people dispersed, they carried with them not only their new languages, but also the seeds of division prejudices against those who could not speak their words, mistrust toward those who were different. Over generations, these seeds would grow into walls far higher than any structure in Shinar. Walls built not of brick and bitumen, but of fear and pride. The scattering created space between nations, but it did not erase the ambition that had led them to build the tower. That same desire for greatness, now separated into many streams, would find expression in the birth of kingdoms, some benevolent, many ruthless, and a few shaped in the shadow of powers far older than mankind's memory. In the wake of Babel's collapse, the scattered peoples carried their languages, their customs, and their ambitions into the far reaches of the earth. Each clan sought to stake its claim in the lands allotted to its ancestors. For a time, the dispersal brought peace. Distance can quiet disputes, but as settlements grew into cities, and cities into nations, the old thirst for dominion stirred once more. The Book of Jubilees does not dwell on the grandeur of these new realms. Instead, it warns of their unseen architects. Though the Watchers themselves remained bound, the memory of their governance, the way they had organized the pre-flood world into a hierarchy of power, lingered in the minds of men. And into this memory, the wandering spirits of their giant offspring whispered. They offered strategies for conquest, designs for fortifications, and rituals to secure loyalty through fear. The first kingdoms after the flood were often built by warriors who could command not only armies, but also the loyalty of priests, seers, and builders whose knowledge reached back to forbidden days. Some claimed divine mandate for their rule, painting themselves as chosen mediators between the heavens and the earth. Others ruled by sheer force, their banners carried into battle alongside emblems that echoed symbols from the age before the waters. Imagine walking through one of these capitals at the height of its power. Towering gates of stone guard the entrance. The streets bustle with merchants, soldiers, and envoys from distant lands. In the central square, a ruler sits upon a high seat, receiving tribute from vassals. To the commoner's eye, this is the order of the world: kings to rule, warriors to defend, priests to interpret the will of the gods. But beneath the surface lies a darker order, one in which allegiance is not only to the throne, but to the unseen powers that guide it. Jubilees cautions that some of these realms became breeding grounds for idolatry and oppression. Statues of strange beings, neither fully human nor fully divine, stood in temples where offerings were made to secure prosperity or victory. The covenant laws given to Noah faded from public life, replaced by systems that rewarded strength and cunning above righteousness. Yet not all the kingdoms were alike. Some remained humble, guarding their borders and respecting the ancient divisions of land. But as the centuries passed, the balance tilted. The most aggressive powers consumed the weaker, forging empires that spanned vast territories. With each conquest, the influence of the old shadow, subtle, patient, relentless, spread wider. These kingdoms would shape the world into which the patriarchs of Israel would later be born. They would form the backdrop for the struggles of God's covenant people, and they would carry forward the same defiance that had brought judgment before. The flood had not ended the war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. It had merely redrawn the battlefield. And on that battlefield, the enemy was still present, not in the open majesty of the watchers, but in a quieter, more dangerous form. It is to this truth, unveiled in the words of the Book of Jubilees, that we now turn. For those who looked only at the surface of the post-flood world, the story seemed straightforward. Evil had been purged. The righteous had inherited the earth, and God's covenant now stood as a safeguard against another universal judgment. But the Book of Jubilees pierces that illusion like a shaft of light into a dark room. Its testimony is stark. The enemy never left. He simply changed his form. The rebellion of the Watchers had ended in chains, but the war they waged did not end with them. The spirits of their offspring, the giants destroyed in the flood, remained on earth. Stripped of bodies, but not of malice. Jubilees tells us that a portion of these spirits was permitted to remain, by divine concession, to test and discipline mankind. The rest roamed under the rule of a leader named Mastema, a figure of cunning and cruelty whose sole aim was to draw humanity back into the patterns of corruption that had doomed the first world. This was the enemy's new strategy, no longer a direct assault with towering forms and visible might, but an infiltration of thought, culture, and desire. He did not need to command armies when he could bend kings through ambition, sway priests through false visions, and corrupt markets through greed. His presence was not proclaimed on banners, it was carried in the quiet agreements made in council chambers, the whispered bargains in the shadows of temples, the slow erosion of the laws God had given. Imagine a great kingdom at peace, its walls strong and its treasury full. On the surface, there is no sign of threat. Yet, in the courts of its ruler, counselors speak words planted by unseen hands. Laws are adjusted, ever so slightly, to favor expedience over righteousness. Festivals drift from the sacred calendar. Worship begins to mingle with practices imported from far-off lands, practices that flatter human pride while severing ties to the Creator. This is how the enemy worked now, not with a roar, but with a breath. Jubilees insists that this condition was not temporary. The adversary's reach would extend through the generations, touching every nation, influencing every era. And though the form of the threat might change an idol here, a false prophet there, the root was the same rebellion born before the flood. The battlefield was no longer the high places alone, it was the human heart. The implication is chilling. If the enemy never left, then every covenant, every renewal, every revival must be defended against him. The flood had been a decisive blow, but not the final one. History since that time has been a series of confrontations between the Most High and the one who seeks to unmake his work. The post-flood world was not the conclusion of the struggle, it was merely the opening of a new chapter in a much older war. And, if this is true, then the next and final chapter of our journey will not be one of resolution, but of reckoning. For if the enemy is still here, shaping the flow of history from the shadows, the question we must face is not simply when he will strike openly again, but who is truly writing the story of mankind. The world after the flood was meant to be a blank page, but by the time the stories of Jubilees reach their close, That page is already crowded with the ink of human ambition, compromise, and defiance. The rainbow still arches as a sign of covenant, but the shadows beneath it are long and restless. Nations have risen, kings have claimed thrones, and the whisper of the ancient enemy threads itself through the halls of power. We began this journey with the image of Noah stepping onto fresh ground, the air still heavy with the scent of judgment past. We end it in a world both familiar and uneasy, a world where the same currents that once pulled mankind toward ruin still move beneath the surface. The flood did not erase the struggle, it only redrew the battlefield. The Book of Jubilees leaves us with a sobering truth. History is not written solely by the victors, nor is it merely the product of human hands. Behind the visible events, there are authors, unseen forces loyal to the Creator, and forces bent on undoing His design. And while men may believe themselves to be charting their own course, they often sail waters whose currents were set long before their time. Imagine holding in your hand a scroll whose ending has not yet been penned. The pages are filled with the rise and fall of kingdoms, the making and breaking of covenants, the battles between faithfulness and rebellion. And now the quill is poised, waiting for the next stroke. The question is not only what will be written, but who will hold the pen. If the enemy has never left, then neutrality is an illusion. Every choice, whether by nations, families, or individuals, leans toward one author or the other. The calendar you follow, the laws you honor, the worship you keep, all of these declare whose story you believe you are living in. The call of Jubilees is not to despair, but to awaken. The same God who set the boundaries of the seas and the divisions of the earth still holds the authority to direct history. The same covenant given to Noah rooted in life, holiness, and sacred time remains a living invitation to walk in step with the Creator's design. So the question stands before every generation: if the post-flood world was not a clean beginning, if the forces that shape the old world still move in ours, then who will you allow to write the next chapter of your life, your people, your world? The pen is ready, the ink is flowing, and the story, though ancient, is not yet finished.